The brain and the spinal cord are protected by the skull and the vertebrae, respectively, but it is also encased in membranes of connective tissue called the meninges, and there are three layers of meninges. The outermost layer, which is continuous with the periosteum of the skull, is called the dura, and this consists of dense connective tissue. And the second layer is the arachnoid layer, and this consists of two layers: an outer arachnoid layer, which consists of dense connective tissue, and the arachnoid space, which is traversed by thin trabeculae of connective tissue, which are continuous with the connective tissue of the innermost layer of the meninges, and that is the pia, which is composed of loose connective tissue. Importantly, the subarachnoid space acts as an hydraulic cushion to protect the CNS, the brain, from trauma. The pia mater lines the neural tissue, and it also lines the perivascular spaces through which blood vessels enter into the brain. Between the pia and the neural elements of the brain is a thin layer of astrocyte cell processes, which we talked about earlier, which form a physical barrier, the glia limitans, or the pia glial membrane, that separates the brain from the cerebrospinal fluid. And if I didn't say it, the subarachnoid space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The blood-brain barrier regulates the passage of substances from the blood to the central nervous system, and it is established largely by three or four components. The first of these are the tight junctions between the endothelial cells that line the continuous capillaries that feed into the central nervous system. And of course, being epithelial cells, endothelial cells are just epithelial cells, they secrete a basal lamina, a basement membrane surrounding them. So this would be the second component of the blood-brain barrier. Thirdly, the pericytes, which are associated with these capillaries and either completely or partially also surround the capillaries. And finally, the foot processes of astrocytes, which completely surround the capillaries. So the transport of nutrients from the capillaries into the neural tissue is almost entirely by receptor-mediated transport. Now, the brain has a number of holes in it. These are called ventricles, and all of these ventricles are filled with fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. And the subarachnoid space that we've looked at is also filled with cerebrospinal fluid, as is the central canal of the spinal cord, which is not shown here. This cerebrospinal fluid is produced by specialized protrusions called the choroid plexus, which are found in all of the ventricles of the brain. The fluid which fills the choroid plexus and fills all the ventricles and flows around the spinal cord has to find its way out of the brain. And this is done through these little protrusions from the subarachnoid space called the arachnoid villi. And fluid produced by the choroid plexus after flowing through the various spaces of the brain finds its way into the sagittal sinus and from there into the venous system, so that there's a balance between the amount of fluid produced by the choroid plexus and the amount that leaves through the arachnoid villi. This diagram shows the choroid plexus, the villi of the choroid plexus, and here it shows how this loose connective tissue of the pia mater, which is highly vascularized, is lined by these ependymal cells. The ependymal cells have tight junctions between them, as is shown down here, and the fluid which flows out of the fenestrated capillaries into the pia mater is actively pumped by these ependymal cells into the ventricular space and then flows through the spaces of the brain. Cerebrospinal fluid is very low in protein but high in ions, particularly sodium, potassium, and chloride, and it has a couple of important functions. It serves as an hydraulic cushion for the protection of the central nervous system. The brain sort of floats in the cushion provided by the cerebrospinal fluid in the subarachnoid space, and it probably serves in a nutritive capacity for the brain.